This style also originated in France, in the Paris region, and spread throughout Europe between the 13th and 15th centuries. It was closely linked to urban expansion and the power of the bourgeoisie. Therefore, important civil buildings were built, such as city halls, exchange buildings, and palaces for the urban oligarchy. However, it remained an essentially religious style, in which the most important building was the cathedral. In Gothic art, God was no longer a stern and distant judge, but represented harmony and light. 5.1. Architecture. 5. Cathedrals were built in grand proportions and were located in cities with an episcopal see. The floor plan of the building resembled a Latin cross, but unlike Romanesque, the arm of the cross or the transept did not extend outwards. Another element that often appears is gargoyles, which are sculptural adornments that depict monsters and fantastic beasts. The weight of the Gothic vault was supported by exterior buttresses with arches known as flying buttresses. The weight of the Gothic buildings rose to a great height and were usually capped by sharp towers with pointed elements called pinnacles. The Gothic building rose in height, and pointed or ogival arches and rib vaults were used. A rib vault was lighter than the barrel vault and was formed by the intersection of two vaults with pointed arches. They were reinforced by cross ribs. The apse at the end of the church was often made up of a series of smaller apse chapels. Rib vaults, supported by a system of buttresses and flying buttresses, meant that walls could be high and thin, and often replaced by large stained glass windows. This gave the effect of brightness and colour on the inside. When a stained glass window was round, it was known as a rose window. As the transept did not extend much outwards, and the apse was much wider, this gave a broader and more compact interior space than Romanesque-style structures. Rib vaults. 5.2. Sculpture and painting. Sculpture. Gothic sculpture differed in some key respects from Romanesque sculpture. It gradually became independent of the architectural framework and gained in expressiveness and movement. It was less distant and cold, too, as it adopted more human characteristics. Themes, although similar, were modified. Christ was no longer presented as an almighty God who was above pain, but as one who suffered from crucifixion. The Virgin was no longer represented as a feudal lady, but as a loving mother. Themes related to Mary were now the most widely used when decorating portals. Funerary sculpture also developed. Members of the higher clergy and nobility were often buried inside churches, and their tombs were carved as recumbent figures. A recumbent figure is a statue sculpture in which the person depicted is lying down, as in the sepulchre of Inés de Castro in Alcobaça, Portugal. See photo below. Painting. In Gothic art, painting also became less strictly dependent on the style of architecture. This is because when large windows were opened up in the walls, it was no longer necessary to decorate them with frescoes as it had been in the Romanesque period. Panel painting therefore became widespread. Nobles, the clergy, and the bourgeoisie commissioned pious works on panels in which they were portrayed. They placed them in their own homes or donated them to churches. Diptychs and triptychs, which were sets of 2 or 3 folding panels, were made. Large altarpieces, which were wooden structures made up of numerous painted panels that were placed upon the altars of churches, also became popular. Noble. 5.3. Outstanding features of European Gothic painting. Giotto. On one hand, in some Italian cities such as Siena and Florence, a very humanized style of painting emerged, with notable painters like Giotto. Jan van Eyck. The other outstanding feature was one which originated in Flemish cities, where a style of realism developed. Jan van Eyck was an important proponent of this style. (6.4) Gothic art. From the 13th century, Gothic art started to be introduced to the Iberian Peninsula. Architecture. The first artistic elements that were specific to Gothic architecture were introduced during the construction of the cathedrals of Cuenca and Avila. They were both still somewhat reminiscent of the Romanesque style, however. The most representative Gothic cathedrals in Castilla were built during the time of Fernando III, 1201 to 1252, in Burgos, Toledo, and León. These cathedrals were built according to the influence of French Gothic. Their central nave is higher than those at the sides. Double flying buttresses were used. Towers' pinnacles reflected the taste for greater height. Mediterranean Gothic. The Crown of Aragon developed its own variant of the Gothic style, known as Mediterranean Gothic. It was characterized by greater decorative austerity, the predominance of horizontal lines over vertical, and the creation of wide and bright interior spaces. Some examples of this style are found in the cathedrals of Girona, Barcelona, and Palma de Mallorca. Mediterranean Gothic was also characterized by the construction of civil buildings, such as palaces and llotjes, or exchanges, including those of Barcelona, Palma, and Valencia. Late Gothic and Isabelline Gothic. From the 14th century, mainly in Castilla, the late Gothic style was predominant. This style, also known as flamboyant, was characterized by the complex ornamentation of buildings, like the Cathedral of Sevilla. The Gothic style remained popular during the reign of the Catholic monarchs at the start of the modern age. During this period, it was known as Isabelline Gothic. Artistic influences from Flanders intensified in terms of decoration, such as can be seen in the Cartuja de Miraflores in Burgos and San Juan de los Reyes in Toledo. Sculpture. Gothic sculpture was characterized by the stylization of forms and a naturalist representation of human figures. This trend was reflected in sculptures that were made on the portals of cathedrals, such as that of León. In addition, we can see important examples of decorative wealth in altarpieces, mainly those made during the late Gothic period, and on sepulchres, which reflect the introduction of non-religious themes. These sepulchres include the Doncel in the Cathedral of Sigüenza, Guadalajara, and those of the Cathedral of Santa Eulalia in Barcelona. Painting. The decoration of Gothic cathedrals, which substituted Romanesque frescoes with stained glass windows, prompted the proliferation of altarpieces and panel paintings. Some of the finest altarpieces are those of the cathedrals of Salamanca and Manresa, Barcelona. Gothic painting developed further during the 15th century in the period known as International Gothic, which revealed influences from both Italian and Gothic painting. The main representatives of this style were found in the Crown of Aragon and included important artists like Luis Dalmau and Jaime Huguet.